Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Panel 3, From P through 12, the challenges of creating a new schoolhouse. Please welcome former Governor of Vermont, the Honorable James Douglas.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. What an inspiring luncheon conversation we just enjoyed, and there's a lot left on our Rise program for the balance of the afternoon, and our first panel is going to get us off to a great start. I'm Jim Douglas from Vermont, and I've spent most of my working life in public service, concluding with 8 years in the governorship. I now teach political science at my alma mater, Middlebury College. I serve on the board of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. You may recall that President Reagan, upon assuming office, placed a portrait of his predecessor, our 30th president, in a place of honor in the cabinet room. He was a real fan. I also serve on the board of the Hunt Institute, a partner in this summit. Well, 14 years ago, not far from here at the JW Marriott, just across the plaza, the National Governors Association sponsored an education summit that featured as our keynote speaker Bill Gates. He told the assembled governors and chief state school officers that if Benjamin Franklin were to return from his eternal rest to behold the nation he helped create, the only institution he would recognize is the public school. Well, indeed, in many ways, the basic framework of our schools has remained the same, but we live in an era when change is rapid in so many aspects of our lives. Our education system needs to evolve to equip students with the tools they'll need to succeed. Education leaders today face daunting challenges, including ESSA reauthorization and implementation. We've seen bipartisan efforts to boost support of early childhood education. Some traditional K-12 systems have seen dramatic changes, such as partnerships with philanthropy and business. Our panel will elucidate examples of state and local systemic changes that honor the challenges of equity while seeking disruptive solutions. Our speakers will offer case studies of collaborative approaches through which they accelerated change in their school district system. We have a great lineup of panelists: Dale Erquiaga, CEO of Communities in Schools; Dr. Diana Rauner, President of the Ounce of Prevention Fund; Nina Rees, President and CEO of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools; Trevor Parker, Senior Vice President of Advanced Placement and Instruction at the College Board; and Utah State Senator Howard Stephenson. Our moderator is Kim Hefling of Politico. So let's now welcome our panel.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here to talk about creating a modern and a new schoolhouse for America's school kids. We have a great group of panelists here today from representing several different viewpoints in education. And I think we should just go ahead and get started. Diana, why don't we talk a little bit about early education? When we talk about building a new schoolhouse, some people might not even think about the littlest of Americans. Where do early childhood programs fit in when we talk about a modern schoolhouse?
Well, thank you very much for starting at the beginning, because as we know, it all starts at the beginning. We know children are born learning. And we know as well that the critical foundations of everything we're trying to build in terms of school success, workforce development, citizenship, really begins with those foundational skills that are built at the very earliest years of life. So social emotional skills like self-regulation, collaboration, grit, executive function, inhibition, behavior control, all of those things that allow students to become successful students, to use Khan Academy effectively, to be able to build on the important activities that are happening in the classroom. All of those things require a level of self-control and development that begins, the science tells us, at the very earliest years of life. So we have to consider a school model, and I know there's a P here, and for me that P is prenatal, because we have to understand that parents are the very first teachers of their children. And so when we think about the early childhood piece of education, we have to include parents and families, honestly, all the way through, but particularly in the earliest years. What we know is that the early childhood system isn't really a system. So while some educational experiences will happen in traditional schools, some will happen in public K through 12 schools that might be pre-K through 12, a lot of early childhood education will happen in a lot of different places. So that system, which is really still in development, it's still very much a dynamic process, has to include community centers, families, homes, as well as churches and other public settings.
Nina, let's now go to you. We've seen a lot of headlines in the last few months about charter schools in California, political pushback. But the promise of charter schools was that they would be innovators in education. Moving forward, where do you see the charter movement fitting in when we talk about a modern schoolhouse or innovating schools? What's the role of charter schools?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned charter schools as laboratories of innovation. In fact, one of the first people who started to talk about charter schools was the late Al Shanker, the head of the American Federation of Teachers. And his goal, and the goal of many of those who started the movement, was about giving teachers more agency in what a school would look like. And to this day, most of our charter school leaders are former teachers and principals in the traditional system who came to the chartering space in order to do something different. What I am really excited about, despite all the noise, is that when you look at our highest performing charter schools, such as KIPP, IDEA, Noble in Illinois, Yes Prep, all of these schools have a number of things in common. Which is that not only are they innovating and serving their students well, but they're now also doing something that we never thought was possible, which was to get these students to college and through college. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that in a minute when we talk about higher education. I think it starts at an early age. We have to make sure that our children are ready to start school, ready to learn. But if our K-12 system is not able to sustain the gains in early childhood education, it's very difficult for them to then graduate high school ready for college. So we're part of this puzzle through and through, and I hope that despite some of the backlash in some of the states, everyone understands that at the end of the day, if you really want to innovate in the public school system, charter schools are probably your best bet.
Now, Trevor, AP classes and standardized tests have been a staple of America's schools for a long time. When you look to the future, where do these things fit in when you think about a modern schoolhouse? I know with the recent admissions scandals, standardized tests have again been in the news, and the role of standardized tests. Can you just comment, just moving forward, where you see?
Yeah, well, I'll comment in terms of the future by looking to the past really briefly. There was this amazing moment in 1995 where an educational research study actually became the topic of cocktail conversation or family dinners. And I think that's the only time I can remember where educational research was chatted about in that way. This was the International Math and Science study that alarmingly found that American math and science students were next to the bottom in international performance, international competitiveness. Thankfully, Austria participated in the study, which kept America from being ranked last. So there was this moment where people felt like the American schoolhouse is not doing what it needs to be to make America competitive. And then 20 years passed, America did not participate in the study over and over again. America stayed out of it. And then in 2015, America decided, because of more sophisticated study design, to re-enter the fray, to participate in this international math and science study again. And a little bit of nervousness this time because Austria wasn't participating in 2015. So America participated, and this did not generate cocktail conversation, but the amazing thing about this follow-up study was that a subset of American math and science students were doubling the international competition on these math and science proficiency benchmarks. And what was interesting about those American students was that they were doing about 2 more hours of math a week than other American students. And that 2 more hours seemed to make all the difference. So why do I start with 2 hours if I'm thinking about the future of the American schoolhouse and about the role of standardized testing and pressure on students? Well, I don't see how we ever become truly internationally competitive across disciplines unless students have the time to focus on doing a few things very well. There isn't a limitless amount of time for students to do hours and hours of additional homework and still have some sort of family and faith and fun during their secondary school years. So I worry about that, and I worry about the pressure from higher education on students to spread their time very, very superficially in their high school years. We have college admissions processes where there's 10 slots for a student to enter in all of their extracurricular activities. When you have 10 slots, you feel like, well, I better be doing 10 extracurricular activities. So I have concerns about all of those pressures. And some of those pressures are AP exams as well. We find colleges that will have a formula in the background that will say, if a student takes 10 APs, we're going to give them extra points in college admissions. When our research shows that like 1 or 2 APs a year maximizes your college readiness. So we need to partner, I think, more effectively with higher education to stop the madness. There's been all this attention on the Hollywood scandal, but what about all these families that are playing by increasingly Byzantine rules for college admissions? How can we calm down and give students time to really do a few things well in high school? What can high schools do? What can state standards do? What can state graduation requirements do to clear the clutter and give students time to excel?
Now, Howard, I know you're a fan of computer-based learning in classrooms. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your experience?
Yes, love to. And by the way, it's not about the device and it's not about the computer. We've heard a lot today at lunch and now on this panel about parent choice and teacher agency. But I'd like to propose that the most important marketplace that we are often ignoring, that is the most important, is a student's agency. That is the marketplace that matters. The engagement of students, that's what matters. And that's why in Utah we have K-3 reading software for 55,000 students who are below grade level. Teachers use this as a tool to do the heavy lifting of instruction in competency for reading rather than replacing the teacher. The teacher then uses the prompts made by the software to provide one-on-one and small group instruction. So rather than trying to be a sage on the stage teaching 28, 30 kids in Utah in one classroom with a distance between the top and the bottom students of about 5 years with the bell-shaped curve in the middle. And if you're teaching in a batch processing system, you teach to the middle of the bell-shaped curve with the kids on the right that are bored, the kids on the left that are lost, and both of them are disruptive. So we honor the agency of the student by engaging them in high-quality software for 20 minutes a day, where the teacher then uses those prompts to make up where they get stuck. And what we're finding, Mrs. Olson, for example, with 38 kids in a dual language immersion school, 4th grade, less than 25% of them were at grade level at the beginning of the year. And I promised her if she would follow this pattern, she would get 90% at grade level. She calls me up at the end of the year and says, we didn't make 90%. We made 95%. And the only 2 of the 38 kids that were not at grade level made the biggest gains of all. They were special ed students who started at an early 1st grade or a kindergarten level and now are reading proficiently at a 3rd grade level, and they made the biggest gains of all. She invited me to come and give awards out to the kids, and we brought them up on the stage one by one as this Hispanic audience of parents and extended family was there as we told each one of them. And this wasn't everybody gets a trophy like in soccer. This is that everybody made more than 1 year growth, and the average was 2.5 years growth, and 60% of the students were a full grade ahead in a single academic year. This should be commonplace if we use the tool, not to replace a teacher, but to repurpose the role of a teacher to be more effective.
Now, Dale, looking back and looking forward, are there some lessons that have already been learned about what types of things are critical when you talk about innovating schools and moving forward? And are there some lessons learned that maybe you could share with us and just share your thoughts on where we should go on this?
You bet. So I'm sitting here listening and thinking, I'm a million years old, and that everything old is sort of new again. I grew up in rural America. I'm from Nevada. I grew up at a time when my parents still told stories of their schoolhouse being a place where you went for dances, you went for rummage sales, you went for potlucks after school hours. Schools were the center of communities. And in my lifetime, we turned them into walled environments that look as much like prisons as they look like schoolhouses. And so I think that what you're seeing in the country today is sort of a resurgence of that desire for whole communities and schoolhouses to be more welcoming and feel like they are places for families, not just in those school hours, but evenings, afternoons, and weekends and summers as well. My organization, I'm really lucky. I work for an organization that's name is exactly what we do. I work at communities in schools. And so we broker community resources inside schools, whether those are food, clothing, shelter, transportation, or something much more complex, dealing with mental health, trauma, anxiety. And so we find in our evidence base for 40 years of work that interaction of communities and the schoolhouse and families and students is exactly what the most at-risk kids in our country need to get across the finish line. You see the 4 murals of 4 of my kids, the Communities in Schools kids, that are on display here. That tells the story of who they are, what they are made of, and due respect to the panel, they aren't made of textbooks or computers or school buildings. They are made of the pressures that Trevor mentioned, that made school difficult for them, and they are made for their moments of success where their agency helped them get across finish lines. And so I think all that bundles together really nicely into sort of reimagining school, maybe in the way that we've forgotten in our country.
Now, we've all watched and seen the headlines the last 14, 15 months of teacher strikes in several states. One thing that the strikes really put a spotlight on was the issue of funding for K-12 education. That's been a big discussion in a lot of states, in part because of the teacher strikes. When we talk about resources in each of these areas, how does this apply to the work you're doing, given the realities of the amount of money available potentially for, say, a community that wants to start a pre-K program but just can't find the money, or an after-school program? Do you each just kind of want to, through that lens, maybe we could start with you.
Sure.
And you can each briefly address that topic.
Communities in Schools is very fortunate. ESSA includes authorization that's very clear that federal dollars can be used for this sort of integrated student support and wraparound service. And so we raise about half the money, and districts pay for about the other half the cost if you look at a national average. So it's a great example of a public-private partnership to leverage limited resources at the school level.
So I think what we've seen in early childhood is that governors and mayors are prioritizing early childhood because they recognize it's a very important investment in the child and in the efficiency and efficacy of the child's education throughout their development. One thing we know, again, the brain is plastic. What that means, for those of you who think it doesn't mean that your brain is made of plastic, it means it's easily changed. So some of the many things that challenge students when they come into traditional schooling around speech and language disabilities or other developmental disabilities, if they're addressed early on, can actually save schools money. So if we are actually thinking about using, as my favorite Nobel laureate James Heckman always says, the adage that skills beget skills, and also the opportunity for the plasticity in the brain, we're actually talking about making investments that then the students and their families can leverage so that they can use their schooling more effectively and more efficiently. So I think what we have to acknowledge is that these are not investments that pay off that year. They're investments that pay off over long periods of time. But particularly when we consider what we would describe as the leaky pipeline of human capital in our country, the fact that in my city in Chicago, we see that only about 5% of our students, male African-American students, are able to graduate college within 6 years. We cannot afford to continue to lose our population because it was too expensive to invest in them early on. We have to consider how to make early investments that then will pay off over, as we know from research, over a lifetime or over a couple of decades.
So I know some teachers feel uncomfortable when I say this, but I do think some advanced placement courses are more important than others. And that's where we're really putting our effort in terms of raising funds to help schools make those available, because there are funding challenges and there are costs to training teachers and providing college-level resources to offer AP classes. We are concerned at sort of the highest levels with making AP computer science available, because we live in a world where the largest source of wage increases are computer science jobs. And we have parents, 90% of parents want their students taking computer science classes, but only 35% of American high schools offer them. 45 states allow computer science to fulfill a high school graduation requirement, but very few states actually require high schools to offer a computer science class. Meanwhile, we have large numbers of students, hundreds of thousands, taking calculus. And I value calculus as one of the supreme accomplishments of the human mind, but I don't ever use it in my day job. Maybe my panelists do, but I don't. It concerns me that there's this huge number of calculus courses available to American students and very few computer science courses. So I am seeing some really good omens on the horizon, that a number of private enterprises, the organizations you would know, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, all provide funding for teacher training. Because the reason schools give, of course, as to why they can't offer computer science, the 65% of American high schools, that's an astounding number, that don't offer computer science. The most common reason they give is, we just don't have the teachers. We don't have a teacher who can teach a computer science class. What we found is that it's actually not that hard to take an existing teacher, even a teacher outside of STEM, English teachers, art and design teachers, and upconvert them to be effective computer science teachers. So these organizations provide a significant amount of funding to help schools train their teachers in the summer. A number of great higher education institutions like Harvard provide free summer training for teachers who want to become computer science teachers at Harvard, with Harvard's curriculum, which is pretty incredible. So I think there is an exciting sort of moment where, at least in that discipline, private enterprise is playing a powerful role in addressing funding issues related to teacher capacity in schools.
Nina, do you have some thoughts?
Yes, I mean, to your question, if there's one area that I believe will make the greatest difference in terms of raising student achievement is investments in high-quality teachers. Whether you're in a public school, private school, charter school, magnet school, that investment is ultimately going to have a return that's higher than anything else you invest in a child's education. When it comes to charter schools, though, unfortunately, as many of you know, we only receive about 70 cents of every dollar that follows students to traditional schools. That number dips to 40 cents on the dollar in some jurisdictions, so it's not a lot. But having said that, there was a new study that just came out of the University of Arkansas that looked at 8 cities that participated in the National Assessment for Educational Progress test. And what they discovered is that in those cities, charter schools were far more cost effective in terms of generating a return on investment. These are cities like Washington, D.C. What these researchers found was that there was a 40% cost effectiveness associated with attending a charter school, and a 53% ROI at the end of the day. So we're very proud of the fact that our schools are eking out every penny that they're getting in order to generate a return on investment, so to speak. But at the same time, we also truly believe that in order for us and any school system to be successful, that we need more funding, and more of that funding needs to be focused on high-quality teachers.
So Utah is the poster child for this question. We spend less per student than any state in the nation. We have a birth rate higher than Bangladesh, and massive in-migration. So when looking at pre-K, we realized that we simply can't afford to provide bricks and mortar pre-K for every student who needs it, especially those at risk. And so we looked at honoring what parents are already spending on their 4-year-olds and adding value to that by putting a computer in the home with high-quality computer-assisted instructional software that would walk them through practices for preparing for kindergarten. And we decided we would have a third-party evaluator look at the results every year. And sure enough, these kids were more prepared than the control group on 2 different measures. The Brigance, they were twice as prepared. On the Bader, they were 3 times as prepared. And they typically enter kindergarten at a first grade level. And that's because they got that, we were honoring their agency as learners as 4-year-olds. Their parents also get parent efficacy training. Once a week, they get a phone call in their language from somebody who helps walk them through how to get your child to be successful, how to read to them at night, how to access the public library, other kinds of things like that. And by the time we're done, these kids are amazing. Just a quick story about Silas, a son of a single dad who is my radio producer on my Saturday morning radio show. I'll tell that more about that if we have time. But he showed up for kindergarten evaluation, having been on the Upstart program. And after introductions with his dad, and him and Mrs. Reed, he stands up and says, "Mrs. Reed, just so you know, I'm the smartest kid in your class." He picks up a book and starts reading it and says, "See what I mean?" And then he notices a chart from 1 to 100 over on the wall. He goes over and starts randomly pointing at numbers and saying what they are. And then he gets really cocky. And he says, 3 plus 4 is 7. 3 plus 7 is 10. See what I mean, Mrs. Reed? And so she's assigned him to read with the first grade reading group so he's not disruptive. And then she also asked his dad after the first week, "There's 3 boys that really have an affinity for Silas. Do you mind if I assign him to be their mentors? Because they're not at his level." And so we want this for every child. In fact, we have it for 20,000 of our 40-plus thousand 4-year-olds. And thanks to Senator Ann Milner, this year legislation starts putting it in daycare centers and other kinds of things so that it can be scaled even more broadly. But it costs only $700 per student because we can't afford $5,000 or $6,000 per kid in a pre-K program.
We hear about employers looking for skilled workers and they can't find them. But yet we also hear about this sort of post-high school gap. What can be done to make students more prepared for post-secondary life? Do you want to start, Howard, and we can go back down this?
For post-secondary?
Yeah.
I think the first thing we need to do is help them to know before they go. Right now, most students are given the impression that all college degrees are created equal. And Carnevale at Georgetown, has, in his work, has shown that not all college degrees are created equal. And he shows the economic value of degrees so that students can know that a STEM degree will make twice the lifetime earnings of a non-STEM degree. That's just important information to know the economic value of a degree, because most students are made to believe that you just get a 4-year degree and you're going to be fine, when in fact a lot of people who got that degree that wasn't marketable are now working at Walmart to try to pay off their loans. So I think we need to be more honest about what the degrees actually mean.
So this is one area where our sector has definitely led the way in pointing it to some best practices, and Richard Widmeyer at the 74 just published a book that chronicles the best practices in some of our high-performing charter schools, again, like a KIPP and Yes Prep and IDEA. A lot of them happen to be in Texas for some reason. But one of the things that he discovered are 3 things that they all have in common. One is this focus on making sure every child believes that he or she will end up going to college. When you walk into these schools, there are banners with the college mascots and flags all over the school to instill that belief at a very early age. The second thing that these schools do extremely well is to make sure that after these students actually go to college, that they stay in college. We all know that if you start school, and many of these first-generation college students, they don't end up finishing school, and your early warning sign happens in that first year when you decide to go back home and drop out. So making sure you're calling them, that you're sending students to the same school, so there is a community of first-generation college students from the same high school at those schools. And last but not least, they are also doing a very good job of trying to find a college or some sort of post-secondary training that fits their needs. So to the extent possible, if it's close to home, it doesn't always have to be the Ivy League school. It's much better for them to go to a school that is going to be a school that they finish without, over spending on that college education. And so finishing this degree is actually extremely important to our sector. There are other things that this book also highlights, but we believe that these things can be replicated in all of our public schools, and things that will ultimately ultimately move our students, our first generation college students, out of poverty and into the workforce much faster. So,
as I think about schools and what they could do to sort of increase college access and affordability and readiness in the 21st century, I think of 3 things. And I do think that the models Nina cited are incredible ones. Noble Network in Chicago has done amazing things to help a wide variety of students gain access to college and succeed once there. And I think we can learn a lot from those models. But I think as we make recommendations or prescriptions for America's high schools, I think of readiness, first of all. Schools should focus on curriculum that is on grade level at least. TNTP's landmark research from last fall found that 70% of students in 9th grade are not receiving on grade level assignments most of the time. They're doing less than 9th grade work. The teachers are afraid to give on grade level work, but the students, meanwhile, are reporting that they're bored in class. They feel like it's a waste of time. At sort of epidemic levels, this sort of wasted 9th grade year feels very problematic if we're thinking about getting kids ready for college. So I think there is a sort of essential move to ensure that students are receiving on grade level assignments most of the time. And the research finds that when that happens, you see all sorts of achievement gaps sort of dissipate rapidly. So sort of a focus on rigor, whether those are classes like AP or IB or pre-AP, or locally sort of designed courses. It doesn't matter as long as they are on grade level most of the time. So readiness. I think secondly, there's an issue with sort of process. Students they're overwhelmed by the number of steps they need to take, and Senator Stephenson spoke about some of these, the number of forms you need to fill out. What is a FAFSA? How do I even navigate the selection of institutions that will be a good fit for me, that will have the right support mechanisms in place? With the ratio of counselors to students, and we've heard panelists already today speak about these dire ratios that we all know, the sort of 1 counselor to 400 students in American education, relying upon counselors to guide students through the process aspect of college readiness is never going to work. So our approach at the College Board is to arm teachers with that information. So moving forward, beginning this fall in pre-AP classes and AP classes, the teachers guide the students through those steps. They help the students fill out a FAFSA. They help them select 4 colleges. They help them get a plan together to apply to colleges. So there's a process element that I think we need to arm teachers to help. I've got to believe that a teacher helping a student fill out a FAFSA and assigning that as homework is going to be more important homework than just one more chapter from a textbook. Because they can read chapters from the textbook every other night. But one night to work on a FAFSA, teachers can be part of the solution here. And they want to be as we talk with them. So there's a process component, and then I think there's an affordability component that is significant given the rising costs of college. So we are, unsurprisingly, as the person who's the head of the AP program, big advocates of college credit opportunities in high school.
May I chime in on that, FAFSA? President Michael Crow at Arizona State University requires every student to fill it out in order to attend that university, and they find out aid that they didn't know they were eligible for, and it has really lowered the cost of their ability to get their degrees.
Sure.
Diana, when you think about this, I was going to say, do you think about this as an issue also in terms of preparing?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to bring the parents back in the room, because research shows that the single most important factor in a child's success in education is how involved their parents are in their education. So that doesn't just happen overnight. For most of us in this room, because we went to college, we understand exactly what we need to do for our kids, and we're doing it. The problem is, and the challenge is for many, many children whose parents did not go to college or whose parents are not available for whatever reason, these children need supportive, encouraging, high expectation parents. The parents we work with, every one of them loves their child, and every one of them, we'll ask every parent of a baby, what do you want for your child? I want my child to go to college. Everyone wants their child to go to college. But do they understand all the steps it's going to take? And we all know that parenting is a long process, it's a humbling process for all of us, and it requires a lot of supports. So where early childhood matters here is that early childhood really is truly a 2-generation program. It's a program that prepares parents to be their child's advocates, their child's leaders, coaches, nags. We absolutely want parents to think all the time about how to advance their child's opportunities, always within legal measures. However, it's really important that we think about, particularly for low-income students and students who are first generation, how we're supporting the family in supporting the child. What we've seen, and we actually are very proud that our first generation, their first graduates of our Educare school in Chicago, the first of now 25 schools across the country, their first graduate class is now their freshman year in college. Everyone graduated from high school, and everyone is in post-secondary education. That's an extraordinary thing, and it's due in great part to the experiences that they had in early childhood, but it's due more than anything to their parents. The support that these kids, again, from very, very challenging environments in the inner city of Chicago, that their parents have had for them, even as they have navigated really terrifying and awful things that no children should have to go through. But all of those kids are succeeding because their parents feel supported and understand their role as their child's first teacher, their child's advocate, the leader of their family, and the ones that are going to keep those kids sticking on their program.
Do you have some thoughts on this topic as well?
Of course. I guess I'll say yes to all of that. I would be remiss if I didn't put a big exclamation point after the social, emotional, and academic development panel. I think those skills are important. And then the other phrase that I would introduce into this conversation is social capital. Kids need parents. Kids also need a host of developmental relationships around them to help them build skills and build social capital. I was really fortunate. My mom used the money that she got as a poll worker to buy me a ticket to a political dinner. At that dinner, I met people who built a developmental relationship world around me that ended up, my first job was working for Ronald Reagan. And not all kids get that. But they all need social capital. They need that access. They need that mentor. They need an intern. They need a developmental relationship. They need a business person who can leverage them into their next step, post-secondary or career. I think that we cannot overlook the importance of relationships, beginning with the parental relationship.
Let's talk about the Every Student Succeeds Act. The promise and the hope of the law was that it would open the door for local districts and states to really innovate in education. I would be interested to hear your thoughts on whether that's working. Are there places where ESSA has opened those doors, or things that you would like to see? Is it too early? I would just be curious to get everybody's thoughts on that. Is there anybody who'd like to go first on that one? Or?
Sure.
Oh,
Go ahead.
I'll beat you to it. So the state chief from Hawaii said this really well. I think the golden door, to quote the president, is open. We're not running through it. I think there's been some work done in my space around indicators like school climate and chronic absenteeism. That's great for my kids. But there's a lot more work that states can do. Now that we have this, we asked for this, folks. I was a state chief before I had this job. We asked for this authority and this power. We'd better use it. Or as an earlier speaker said, it'll be gone again. So.
And it's
Some
my
early
understanding
success.
It's up for reauthorization next year,
Yeah,
right?
that's like, you're going to give me nightmares, Kim. Don't talk about that.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. Do you have any more thoughts on that?
I'm good.
Okay.
I think I've said enough.
So I was just going to say that while ESSA is thought of as a K-12 bill, it actually, for the first time, really encourages states to think about integrating and aligning their early childhood system with their K-12 system, encourages them to think about using Title I dollars differently to support early childhood, and really importantly thinks about alignment. One of the things that we've been doing in our programs in Chicago is a project we started with some charter schools in Chicago that we called our Birth to College project. And it was really about getting our Birth to 5 school aligned with an elementary school and thinking about how to ensure that those transitions between preschool and kindergarten happened really with the weight of the work on the adults instead of the children. What we found is that really getting teachers on the ground, early childhood teachers and early elementary teachers on the ground to talk about what they did and align their teaching and understand the continuum that it was really on them to create, made huge differences in both children's ability to move seamlessly through from preschool, kindergarten, and into early elementary, and again, the family supports that surround them. So I think that the exciting thing for us in ESSA is the opportunity to think about alignment and to think about different ways that school systems can integrate early childhood systems into their thinking, even if it's not happening in their buildings.
Do you have some thoughts, Trevor?
I do. Something exciting, this is minor, but I think exciting. I think a theme I hear from many families and communities is we need fewer assessments, we need fewer tests, and more opportunities. And so it's exciting that under ESSA we've seen states sort of try to collapse the number of different assessments students are sort of jumping throughout their secondary school career, because ESSA's allowed for sort of the replacement of multiple tests with a single test to serve one purpose. So the reduction in number and quantity of assessments seems like a valuable sort of minor part of ESSA, but one that I think is good. On the flip side, I really agree with Dale. It's been, I think, less exciting, the lack of innovation we've seen from many states in designing indicators that would sort of spur really sort of exciting school choices from principals and superintendents as to what sort of courses they're requiring students to take for graduation and things like that. I think those aspects have been less exciting than I think the crafters of ESSA originally envisioned, unfortunately.
Well, I think in the interest of being a little provocative, I think it remains to be seen whether ESSA will actually spawn more innovation and be the law that will raise student achievement and close gaps more aggressively than the previous laws before it came about. A lot of this depends on who the state chiefs are and if they're willing to take some of the flexibility that's now on the table seriously and to push the envelope. In Texas, one of the things we've noticed is that they're using one of the provisions in the law that allows you to use a 7% set aside to restructure your failing schools to open charter schools in those jurisdictions. So we think that's a step in the right direction. Starting a new school, starting from scratch is always better than to go to a school and deal with all the things that school has dealt with over the years. So we hope that more states take advantage of that. But at the end of the day, all eyes are on these state chiefs and their governors to see if they will actually leverage what ESSA has to offer. Because if they don't take advantage of it, in 10 years, we're going to be back in this room talking about the federal government taking over, or trying to be a little bit more prescriptive on the things that work and don't work when it comes to federal spending.
I was privileged to be in the White House for the signing of ESSA, along with I was on the National Conference of State Legislatures. I was the Education Standing Committee co-chair, along with Sharon Tomiko Santos from Washington State. Mm-hmm. And President Obama called it the Christmas miracle, which it truly was. But what we find is that with a baby elephant, you put a rope on its leg tied to a stake and that it can't break. When that elephant grows up, you use the same size of rope and it won't break it, even though it easily could. I find the same thing with teachers and principals and school boards and superintendents. We're so used to that restrictive rope that we're not conscious of breaking free. The best example of breaking free was Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and I visited their schools since the reconstruction. And there's amazing good things happening there, especially with the charter schools that have just exploded, replacing that need that hadn't been provided with the destruction. I was part of the international study group of the National Conference of State Legislatures, where we looked at the highest ranking countries on the PISA International Report Card. Not a single one of those high-ranking countries has an end-of-level high-stakes test. And isn't it ironic that we would actually, no psychometrician or statistician would say that you should use as valid an exam holding adults accountable when the exam doesn't count for the person taking the exam. I mean, that's insanity. But the other thing that the International Study Group found is that those countries that are high-ranking, we asked, where did you get these ideas? We got them from American research. We're implementing American research. I was in Shanghai, and the Shanghai Normal School, which is their teacher college, was throwing down the gauntlet, saying, you are a capitalist nation, yet you pay your teachers based on longevity. We are a communist nation. We have coveted tiers of achievement on which we pay our teachers based on their ability to teach. The other thing is that we have 1,400 teacher colleges in this country, each doing their own thing, whereas in Finland and China and other places, they tell their teacher colleges, here's what we want you to do in preparation of teachers. And then when they're inducted with an amazing support group. In America, typically, you give the teacher the role, the classroom, and say, good luck, invent education, as if that first-year teacher could. And in China, they would never dream of allowing a first-year teacher to develop a lesson plan. Their job is to learn proven lesson plans and be judged on how they can deliver them with expertise. And then, slowly, as they learn, they are able to they call their lesson plans polished stones. And they can help burnish those stones further as they acquire skills. But our teachers are more of a solitary job, in those countries, they're very public. Teaching is a public process with a lot of observation, a lot of daily feedback.
We've covered a lot of ground here, a lot of different ages, a lot of topics, but looking forward, let's talk about solutions. If you had one or two solutions when we discussed this idea of framing or building a modern schoolhouse, what's your solution wish list? do you each just want to touch on that a little bit? Do you want to start?
Yeah, wish list, I guess, more than solution. Let's remember what America looks like today. Children of color, children who live in poverty, whether they be white or children of color, that is the American family today in many, many schools. And so as we look for solutions, we have to look for solutions that work for all kids, not just kids that look like, frankly, the folks on this stage.
And I'll just say that sitting here in Washington, really the exciting work is happening in communities and at the local school district level. I think the important challenge is how are we going to harness all of that momentum and all of that innovation and share it more rapidly and more effectively so that the great things that are happening on the ground can be replicated and scaled.
I hear a lot of sort of blaming the student, frankly, as we talk about the problems of American education. I hear a lot of, oh, it's this generation of student lacks motivation or things like that. And I haven't seen that in the research, clearly. I haven't seen that there's something endemic to this generation of students that is making American education so fraught or problematic. I do think that there is evidence that the adults surrounding children of this generation have put in place a sort of an obstacle course of requirements and stressors that prevent students from focusing on a few things well. So my wish list is fewer, clearer, more relevant high school graduation requirements that are set at the state level and that align with the careers that are available and promising in the 21st century.
I would say greater investments in research and development, as Mrs. Rauner highlighted. As a country, we don't spend enough in this field, in the healthcare sector, any other sector that's scaled rapidly. There's a huge amount of investment in R&D. When it comes to education, we tend not to make it a priority at the federal level, state level, or even in the private sector. And I think that's really crucial if we're really serious about learning from what's happened so far and replicating the success. Next to that, though, I would also say, to the extent there are high-performing charter schools out there, one of the unfortunate things that I've noticed is instead of celebrating the success of these schools, unfortunately, some district officials see them as competition. We need to do a better job of breaking down the barrier between the dialogue that needs to happen for these two spaces to work in collaboration. They're both in the public sphere. They're both serving the needs of their community. And we need to have more mayors and local officials who understand the value of this dialogue and making it possible so that we're not talking in silos or in our own conferences constantly.
I would agree that putting more focus on those kids at risk. Another thing that those high-performing countries on the PISA, they put considerably more resources at the kids who need it at most. You've all seen the regression line of parent income, parent education attainment. These kids are doing well, these kids are not. Well, these are the canaries in the mine that tell you what your school system is actually doing. Because these kids up here are almost teacher-proof, school-proof. It's amazing what we can do when we focus on that. I was that legislator. I prided myself on my conservative voting record who opposed school breakfast. I opposed after-school programs. I opposed extended day kindergarten. I opposed psychologists in the schools because my kids didn't need an after-school program. We're running to soccer and music lessons. How dare you have government intervene in my family? Until my wife and I were called to be volunteers at the Salt Lake Valley Youth Detention Facility. And in the very first week, we realized the only difference between those kids and my kids and the kids in my neighborhood is environment. That's the only difference. And as I looked into their faces, I realized that many of them would go home from school to an empty house and wander the neighborhood looking for belonging and finding it in gangs instead of an after-school program that I denied them. And I can tell you that 2 years of voluntary service turned into 5 because I was trying to compensate for the harm I had personally done to them. And I'm now a strong advocate of all these things. I understand why school breakfast is important. The blood glucose, the brain needs that energy. I understand why these kids with toxic stress need a psychologist at the school to help walk them through what they were experiencing. I understand why they need after-school programs. And so in my public repentance, I just want to acknowledge that we have an obligation to pay attention to these canaries in the mine, because that is a measure of who we are as a society. Frankly, I actually sponsored in my final year in the Utah legislature funding for school psychologists. So now, hopefully, these kids with toxic stress are getting the support they need.
Can I add to my wish list more experiences of proximity like the good senator? Bless your heart, sir. That's a great transformation.
Well, thank you, each of you, for appearing on the panel. This has been a really interesting conversation. You've all given me a lot of story ideas, so thank you. And,